in the current humanitarian response, there's an attitude to believe that the needs of very young children between 0-3 and 0-5 are mostly related to their health, their nutrition, and their vaccination. So educational and protection needs may seem to be a little bit overlooked. With this goes working with parents of very young children that both sectors might not be prioritizing as a target group, despite the specific needs of this group of children. And there could be also an issue with needing to build more evidence about the benefits of working with the youngest children, working on ECCD program, and therefore build the case to further promote this line of work. The next area of work that we looked at, if briefly, is psychosocial support. This is another area where naturally multiple sectors should come together. So PSS by nature should be looked as a multi-sectoral area of work, building resilience or strengthening resilience of children and adults being the ultimate goal of this area of work. However, it is often classified as being a child protection area of work, we have identified some issues in terms of quality of implementation of PSS programs, for example, and we are not entering into details, quality of implementation of child-friendly spaces that seem to open quite an area of larger discussion. In the education sector, PSS is often promoted through promoting socio-emotional learning approaches, and we've been mentioned successful programs designed and implemented by a number of international organizations that seem worth looking at or even promoting. However, even in this regards, an obstacle could be identified, such as some educators may not believe in the need or in the importance of including social-emotional learning or PSS in the education package, believing that there should be more of a focus or exclusively a focus on educational outcomes such as literacy, numeracy, or they may feel unqualified to contribute child well-being as not being this within the remittances of their daily work. Across the board, in terms of both prevention and response, we have tried to group some of the findings from this research under a topic that is about working in school and working in out-of-school situations. So, in particular, it has emerged that out of school, and when there's an educational deficit, for example, because of war or displacement, the two sectors struggle the most to work together. So the education sector, including EAEs, the EAE sector, are very focused on the primary school level, and in particular in the school as the main fortress of education programming. Child protection works much more in outreach with displaced populations. However, the two seems to struggle to get together when we are in critical situations such as educational gaps. So making schools more inclusive in terms of reaching out and allowing mainstream education for children who are not in school, and also working jointly on identifying probably stronger non-formal solutions and creative solutions when schools are closed. So apparently children who are the most excluded from the benefits of collaboration are out-of-school children, being this, however, also the group of the most vulnerable during crisis, and oftentimes it has to be remembered before crisis, because in many of the countries we work, out-of-school populations are substantial. Just to name a few possible groups that fall under the category of out-of-school children, we looked at children with disabilities, unaccompanied children on the move, adolescents above 13 years old approximately, children exploited through the worst form of child labor, and children living and working in the streets. So we also thought that referral pathways, which is working through referral pathways, which is what many child protection agencies do, could be a way to bridging or help bridging this gap in between the two sectors for out-of-school children. However, the multi-sectoral function of referral pathways seems to struggle to be recognized. It tends to fall under the remittances of child protection. And we also know how difficult it is to implement referral pathways that should also involve the institutional systems of both education, child protection, health, justice. Here, referral pathways could be a means to bridging the gap, but they might not be necessarily currently sufficiently supported in humanitarian responses. Just to end with one more topic for discussion that has been identified in this research, we tried to capture information or findings that relate to the donors and the funding level. It has emerged that many donors have, in fact, a monosectoral mandate. So they find either EIE or child protection in humanitarian action, and they might show some level of inability to become flexible in including some activities in the sector that they are not traditionally funding. It has also emerged that some of the typical characteristics of humanitarian funding are not conducive to collaboration. For example, the typical fact that these are short-term funding, like at best 1 year funding is the norm. They are unpredictable, and as said, they are non-flexible funding. It has also emerged that for practitioners, it is a challenge how donors make their own allocation decisions, the way they decide how to invest their funding. So coordination in between donors is also something that may not necessarily be very functional at the field level at this stage. It's not all bad, however, because it has clearly emerged that there is probably a new tendency in terms of donors' mentality, who are becoming more and more interested and open to support collaborative efforts. And again, to end on a positive note, throughout this research, we have identified a number of opportunities that we hope can be built upon to pave the way forward towards more effective collaboration. This slide is only showing a few of those that are better represented in the paper that you have. And well, even the fact that we are at this conference today under the guidance of the Inee and the Alliance is an opportunity, I think, to build on collaboration. And as Hani mentioned, this is also kind of the evolution of a process started in 2013. Jasmine this morning has mentioned the Education Cannot Wait Fund, which is a relatively new initiative and probably one of the few, if not the only, funding stream where collaboration and probably integration of the two sectors is not only promoted, but is the objective, unlike typical monosectoral call for proposals that are instead the norm in the humanitarian system. We have also been said, for example, that the Global Education Cluster and the CP Area of Responsibility are issuing guidance to coordinators at the country level to make sure that the two sectors develop together joint strategies at the country level. And there will be many more that you can find in your paper. So I think that I'm only left with
Suggest if we could have a slight overrun, okay, of 15 minutes to eat into your lunch break a bit, so that we could have some questions and answers. So if we do have the mic, can I see hands in terms of questions? Any question? Yes, we have somebody from, okay. So we'll walk the room this way. One, okay, you can start, but why don't we start with the lady in green? Yeah, okay. And then we walk this way to all the way to.
Hi, thanks for that great presentation. I just wondered if during it was really interesting to hear you talk about the kind of the issue of both EIE and CPHA practitioners feeling that it's very highly specialized, and whether or not you came across any good examples of how that had been overcome. I think sometimes there's a lot that can be done by non-professionals in terms of securing children's attendance at school and making sure children who are vulnerable can access education, sustainably, but without, strict, case management, referral systems and pathways. So I was just wondering if you'd come across any good examples of that.
Well, thanks for the presentation. From my perspective and where I work, I think as some of these highlights that you've provided are actually working in there. And one specific aspect has to do with donor funding. In recent times, we had an experience where there was a pool of fund, and then they said that education and child protection, of course, they cannot receive those funding unless their activities are integrated or mainstream into other sectors. And this became a serious argument that we had to actually push, and in the end, we saw that certain amount, like 15%, was allocated. But then there are some donors that are actually pushing for education and child protection to present joint proposals because they have common objective, common target, and so I'm looking forward, and I don't know how we can go about this by encouraging more donors to see how best they can push for such an integration in terms of providing funding for education and child protection, because that reduces the funding gap that child protection oftentimes will have in terms of their programming.
There was somebody, no, let's take then we come to the step.
I wish to appreciate all the presentation that you have had, and also allowed the recommendation, I think, by Sir Bonwell, that in order to succeed in the education and child protection, we need to engage the community. It's unfortunate that most of our systems in Africa are much more of teacher-centered. In other words, that if a teacher is not there, then education does not take place. Or if a learner is not in school, then education does not take place. So my question is, and to any of the presenters, how can we best come up with approaches using the systems that be to encourage learner-centered approaches so that education takes place during emergencies or any time without the teacher or the classroom. Thank you.
And then to this table.
Thank you for your presentation and for all your efforts. Considering especially for the national systems, that is what I am really concerned, because from our experience, even though we worked hard to combine, to integrate child protection and education, that is the area that we failed, because the sense of ownership from the government side on the system issue is as a problem. Both Minister of Education and Minister of Labor and Demand Welfare, they have their own independent systems. And to bring them and to change that system is very difficult. So I wish if you can come across with some intervention mechanisms that we can be able to proceed on this area. Additionally, especially regarding the out of school, that is one of the entry points that we can address. And that can be taken into consideration because from our experience, majority of the bottlenecks which push out of school children to be out of school is related to poverty, disability issue, distance issue, which also affects us for security and violence, and at the same time, other cultural related barriers are there. So this entry point can be also a good issue that can be taken into consideration as a collaboration between the two sectors. And thank you so much for that.
I'd have also appealed to colleagues to keep the point short so we can have as much. Helen. No pressure, Helen.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I mean, for me, it's just looking at the ABC of collaboration, so looking at the actions and behavior, and we all know that our actions and our behavior have consequences. But I think a lot of, from this morning and up to now, we've heard a lot about the action part. So the interventions and the details in the matter of the sort of interventions we need to put in place. But you know, we've also analyzed how these interventions can contribute to healthy child development. But I'm just wondering whether we'll also have space to look at, or even some, you know, to also hone in into some of the behaviors that I think can also be a huge bottleneck, regardless of how much you analyze your actions.
Okay, I want to pause at this point. I'm going to come to the left side of the room soon. I want to pause at this point and turn it over to the panelists. Right. To the researchers, yes. Can you start?
Maybe a quick one. Now I forgot who's the sir who mentioned that encouraging donors to go to be more open to funding, integrated programming or collaborative efforts. This is also interestingly part of the expected outcomes of this conference, and there's also a side event where the representative of a small portion of the donor community will meet tonight. From our perspective, what we have learned through this research, that was one of the few messages that we've been able to share right now, is that there is an open mind attitude on the part of many donors, probably not all, but several, and we kind of seem to notice that there is a shift, as in there is a momentum that is being created. So it's probably really an opportunity in terms of going forward. However, I would also encourage and everybody of you, anytime you have conversations with your donor, especially with your institutional donors at the country level, to build the case for collaboration. If you encounter resistance, there's also, you know, material like this research or some of the resources we have consulted that show the benefit of collaboration, so probably you would be able to convince them, and therefore there's, I guess, also responsibility for the recipient organization to help building the culture and donors' understanding of the benefits of collaboration. That could also be measuring how you do it in your own programs and show outputs, concrete outputs as to what has improved thanks to that approach. I was particularly intrigued by a question that I find extremely difficult to answer because, well, it's definitely not for me, but maybe I could tell you what I think about how to encourage or how to ensure education carries on even amidst the crisis when teachers are not there. As said, well, I don't have a solution to that, but I can say that there have been NGOs that have created learning programs for out-of-school children for kind of self-education making use of, how do you call it, high technology, like tablets, whatever they're called. There's also other things that could be done at the community level to improve learning outcomes of children, school-going children, but I think it could be applied also when children are unable to access school. That is, for example, improving literacy and numeracy through community-based approaches. And there are packages, materials that, again, NGOs have developed that combine school or learning center, education with community-based education. Peer-to-peer approach, like a budding system, so older children helping younger children. That could also be very useful to learn about protection risk and how to become agents for your own protection. So I'm not trying to answer the question, I'm just giving some food for thoughts or maybe pointers on that.
Okay, I think that the first question was about how to bridge the teachers' gap for both, it was about teachers, right? Specialization.
They highly specialize, the issue of specialization.
Specialization of the two sectors, okay. It has to be said that this is a perception, and this is an answer we gather from our participants, that the idea of the other sector being too much specialized could be an obstacle. But what we also think is that, again, this mostly is maybe in the minds of the practitioners, because sometimes, especially at field level, practitioners have to learn about the other sector, so they are more maybe used to collaborate, and also they are a little bit experts of the other sector, even if they are not specialized in this other sector. So it is true that the education has its own agenda, and that child protection, it's true that it's technically specialized, but personally I think that yeah, this is of course something that we think, that we are afraid of. We think that we cannot be at the height of understanding at least some aspects of the other sector. And of course, the other colleagues can be there to explain and to create this link, I think. And then there was a question on working through national systems. So, yeah, so I didn't get maybe the last part of the question, I'm sorry. But what we would like to highlight, despite the differences between the two sectors, education and child protection are working through, there is an important point to be highlighted, which is that the education sector is perceived, again, or seen as a possible entry point for the child protection sector, and also for the child protection system to be strengthened. So this is indeed something we didn't have time to point at, yes, but this is a sort of mutual empowerment. And since we know that this education system will be in place somehow, even if not perfect, this could be seen as an entry point for the case loads and all the work child protection is doing.
Thank you. Let's on this side, on the you're on the wrong side. Run over there. I'll come back to you. Don't worry. I won't forget you.
So thanks again for the presentation. I think one of our colleagues mentioned the role of communities, which I think is really foundational, but I also was curious about the role of caregivers and looking at the coordination between education and child protection and what you found in regard to how we can really collaborate with caregivers to support the well-being of children.
Okay. I mean, can we take the point has been raised? Okay, great. Okay, right. They're reading from the same script, okay. Going, gone. Okay, over to you. And then I'm going to ask Dean and Honey. Ah. You know, I have a blind spot on my right. Can we take the two questions? Then I'm going to ask Dean and Honey to round up, okay? I mean, you can answer the question on the caregivers. Just one moment.
Thanks. It was more of a comment than a question. It was one of the last points you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting. This idea of integrating the cluster development strategies. I carry around with me the Education Cluster Development Strategy Guide. And I think as a very pragmatic way of, you know, working more closely together, particularly at the field level, that, for me, if this roundtable comes out with a recommendation that says we can come up with a joint, you know, cluster strategy development, I think that would be absolutely terrific.
Thank you. Also, perhaps more of a comment than a question. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really clear and interesting. I found it an alarming call to action that you mentioned that the cluster system is an obstacle to coordination between education and child protection, since the transformative agenda was set up with that as one of its key purposes. So comment stroke question, what do we do with that information? Who do we take that to? And how do we in this room take action on that?
Okay, yeah. Please go ahead. I think the question on how can you take action on the obstacle of the cluster system, maybe you may want Dean and Honey to comment on it. But the first question was on the caregiver.
Yeah, on the comment concerning the guidance on how to develop joint strategy, I think it was more a comment than a question, indeed. And indeed, we agree that this was, of course, we gather many case studies or many examples of good collaboration. So, of course, here we didn't have time to share with you. But this one, of course, was as an opportunity, was important to be shared, because we agreed that this could really be an opportunity to build on for all the practitioners here in this room, I think. And concerning the question or the comment on the caregivers, absolutely, we found a gap in the work with caregivers. So, as Serena said before, well, as Joan also said, when we talk about ECCD, mostly when we talk about ECCD, this work with caregivers, it's something we cannot just let in a corner. So, of course, this should be improved, but not only for instance, in ECCD at an early stages. Also, I think, yeah, all the life cycle of the child, we found there is a gap. So this link with families is not emphasized at all. And this is why, for instance, we said that the education sector worked through a school, at a school level. So we were wondering, while we were drafting the paper, if we had to put school and community level, because of course parents should be involved and are involved somehow when we, for instance, we think of the teachers or the parents associations or clubs around schools. But then on purpose, we decided not to include this because we think this is a goal, this is an objective, but this is not properly done. And we think that all these clubs and all these communities' involvement are not enough, of course, to ensure this link to families and caregivers. You want to add, Serena?
Maybe the fact that also, well, ECCD is an area where we looked at how caregivers and parents should or could be better involved. Psychosocial support is also a thematic area where some probably training packages are available from international organizations that deal with caregivers, not only with the child. So there could be both. The gap on working with caregivers, I think, is particularly acute by definition with the groups that can be defined as those who benefit the least from collaboration in between the two sectors, that are, for example, unaccompanied children on the move, some adolescents, children living and working in the streets, or children in worse forms of child labor, because oftentimes these groups of children are typically living in known family environments, so they are deprived from adult care, a role model. They don't learn about affection, how to grow as adults. Well, we don't have the solution, so we only found the problem. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Over to Dean and Hani.
Hello? Yeah, okay. I'll just bring back some of these questions to something that was discussed earlier, and that's this change in the perspective. I feel like a lot of the questions that are being asked and what came out of the research suggest that we're still, our departing point is the sectoral approach, that we are within child protection, we're within education, and we're moving forward, and then we face these obstacles. So just starting, for example, the question about the specialization. If you really look at the core competencies of the core body of education and child protection, a lot of them are transferable. So when you're developing your capacity building approaches, if you start by saying, this is what child protection does, this is what education does, of course you're going to create these parallel worlds. Whereas if you start by, this is how a child develops, and this is what child well-being means in the long run, and then say, to get there, these are things that are needed, and work backwards. Even your specialization is going to be much more intertwined, and so I actually want to challenge this idea that we really specialize. We are specialized, and it's good, and we cherish specialization, but it's not the majority of the body of the workers that are actually getting the work done at the field level. You talk about behavior, which was a very, very interesting point, that all of us have to look internally within how we behave in terms of collaboration, and a lot of it again goes back to how we look at our function. If you look at our function as the well-being and healthy development of a child, our behavior is naturally going to change, because then we're not going to say, let's not overwhelm, as Cornelius was saying, let's not overwhelm the curriculum, when what the child needs is to deal with the toxic stress that they're dealing with on a daily basis in a refugee camp or in a context of movement of populations. So it's the starting point to a lot of these. I want to quickly say something about the donor question. I think, and this has come up actually in almost every single annual meeting that we have had, that there's this sense that donors are solid, they're not going to change, and we are the ones that have to follow. We do inform what donors fund to a certain extent. Of course, there's political will and all of that involved. But what we do, and what as sectors, as technical people do and put out there as suggestions and our approach, informs also what. So let's make sure that we see that as a two-way street. There are some limitations, and we should address it, but it's not everything. And I'll close by just mentioning the question about the cluster approach, or generally the sectoral approach, or even what you termed as within agency sectoral silos. I actually want to suggest that it is potentially an obstacle, but it doesn't have to be an obstacle. I think even within the current structures, we can work significantly closer with each other if we have that shift in perspective. Maybe the ultimate goal is to break down all the silos, but I want to suggest that there's a lot more we can do within the current structures than we seem to suggest, and in terms of the what silos prevent us from doing so.
So I turned 50 this year, so now I get to say back in the day. So I'm going to take you back to 2005 after the tsunami, and at that time I was actually coordinating both child protection and education. And that meant I got to go to lots of coordination meetings for child protection and education. And I remember going to those meetings and thinking, well, we're talking about the same thing. We might be using different terms, but we're actually facing the same issues. And so proposed that maybe once in a while we meet together. And I think that also is looking at, you know, what Hanny just said on there's some creative ways we can look at this issue on coordination, how we come together. And it is quite simply sometimes, and we did the same thing in Palestine. Once in a while, meeting together in those coordination groups can really overcome quite a few obstacles. And so that made me think of Jonas and what he said in the organization of his programming. He's actually put the staff together in the same office. And then that made me think of Joan again and how she said, just have lunch. So I think we should have lunch.
Thank you, Dane. Let me turn over to Minje, who's going to make some announcement, but I can assure you she's not going to keep you from lunch.
Thank you. No, actually, I'm going to explain to you what's going to happen from now until the end of the day. Before we break into lunch, just for your information, I will ask you to exit this way, and you will find flip charts with color stickers. These flip charts with color stickers are set up to indicate the breakout session of the afternoon that will happen from 3:30 onwards. So, which means that we will break into 3 groups. So I'm going to invite you to think about which session you would like to attend and to grab a color sticker that you will put on your badge, your clothes, etc. And we will explain to you when we return which room, which color. So we will invite you to go to the right room at the time of the coffee break. Just to give you an overview, the parallel session number 1 will be looking at children affected by armed conflict, protection and education. The parallel session number 2 will be more looking at collaboration within existing programming approaches. And the parallel session number 3 will look more at non-formal education and safety in school. Okay? In the meantime, time has come for lunch. And I'm sure that after all these food for thoughts, it's time to give food for our body to keep going through the day. The lunch will be served in, and I'm sorry if I don't say it right, Nyachoma area. And apparently I didn't say it right. Oh? Namachoma. Which will be right down after the bridge. Okay? It's now almost 1, so I would suggest to be right on time at 2. 1:45? 1:45, so we can start at 2 on time. And I would like to give a round of applause for the panel, but as well for Mr. Cornelius Williams, who has been with us throughout the morning. Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes I think of those days.